What did you sing, Rita? Spanish, all right. Yeah, I love that. Maybe next time we'll have you just come up here and lead it in Spanish. Yeah. So, if I've said it once, I've said it a million times. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. You can be at the right place at the wrong time, it doesn't work. And if it's the wrong time, it's just the wrong time. Now, if we're going to follow Jesus, follow God, we need to know it is in God's own time, not ours. Now, that's kind of rough because we like to do things in our own time, right? We make our plans. We got calendars that have stuff on them all year. You know, at the end of the year, we look at the new year and we start putting more stuff on it. You know, we really are into doing things in our own way, in our own time. But we can't follow God in our own time. It has to be God's time, the right time. I mean, how many of you like to wait in line? You know? Oh, great, I get to go to Disneyland so I can wait in line. Perfect. How many of you like to drop everything and do what somebody else tells you to do? Depends on what it is, right? Yeah. Mostly no, but, you know, there might be something that somebody says, go do it, it'd be perfect. So, you know, hold out that option. But that's what the story's about. Jesus is calling people. He's calling them. Now, we're all the way in 14 verses in the Gospel of Mark. 14 whole verses. And Mark begins to say, and now here's the dramatic twist. I mean, how many books have you read where you got in 3 paragraphs and then there's a dramatic twist? You know? But that's what Mark is saying. There's something happening here. It's happening quick. And then we find right after that there's a couple of words. Barbara's was a little different, but the gist of it is immediately. Immediately. It happens twice. So, here in the 14th verse, 3rd paragraph. John was arrested. Now, that's not just, for us to go, okay, John was arrested, now we know a little bit more about John. But John was arrested. Something's happening here. And immediately it says something happens. And then immediately again. Now, part of what Mark's saying, by saying John was arrested, was to say that following God can be dangerous. Following God can have a cost. It can be fraught with peril. I try to figure out how to spell fraud. It's not how I spelled it here. But following can be dangerous. And then we think, if we follow God, everything's going to be perfect. But John was arrested. Something's happening here. And immediately, something happens. Now, I want you to know, immediately is not all of a sudden. Sometimes we think the two are synonymous. It's not. In our lives of faith, immediately is not all of a sudden. Immediately is the end of our waiting. It's the end of our waiting. If we're ready to follow God, when God is ready, when God calls us, then until that point we're waiting. So the immediately simply means now the waiting's done. And it's time to move forward. Sometimes we realize we're waiting and sometimes we don't. There are some things that it's just, we kind of know. Something's in the mix, something's brewing, and we wait. And sometimes we don't, and we're just simply surprised. But in our lives of faith, that surprise is simply the end of our waiting. It's time to hear, it's time to say yes, it's time to move on. In our lives of faith, if we are not immediately following, then we are waiting. It's that simple. The question then is not, can you wait? It is, are you ready to immediately follow? Are you ready to immediately follow? If you were taking notes anywhere, you might want to ask the question of yourself, am I ready to immediately follow God? This is how Mark begins. He first calls 2 brothers who are fishing. They're casting their nets out into the sea. And he said, follow me. And they left their nets and they followed him. It doesn't say whether they pulled the nets in first. Might still be out in the water. They stopped what they were doing and they followed. And then he walked along the shore a little further, and he saw 2 more fishermen. And immediately he called them and said, "Follow me." Now, sometimes we think, okay, Jesus called 2 fishermen and 2 fishermen. That's not quite right. Mark called the first two fishermen in the middle of their shift. They were at work. You know, how many of us would be ready to leave what we're doing, our work, and go? But then he sees 2 more fishermen. But these are fishermen who are not workers. They do work, but they are owners. Zebedee and sons. They own the business. They own the boat. And so he calls them from their family. They just walked away from their dad. And from the hired workers. They were attending to their business obligations. And they left those behind. If you notice, there are 3 of our biggest allegiances. Our work consumes an awful lot of our time and energy. And sometimes we bring work home with us, or we neglect our families because we've got to get our work done. Second is family. He calls them to leave their family. Follow me. And the third is business obligations. They're responsible for other people who get paid because they work. And the 3 biggest allegiances. That's what this story is about. Jesus calls us to follow God's plan. It seems like it's all of a sudden. But simply the waiting's over and the time is to begin. Merrill Scott in the upper room wrote, "One summer morning when I was very small, Mother woke me with the words, 'Get up and dress quickly. I'm frying trout for breakfast.' Astonished, he said, I wondered how we could have newly caught fish when the day had just begun. At the table, I learned that my father had driven at dawn to his favorite fishing spot. And he got a strike on almost every cast. The unexpected breakfast was less of a surprise than the starting realization that my parents lived a life quite separate from mine. Their activities were not limited to my waking hours." That's quite a thing to learn. Now, I don't have that same sense with my parents, but I do with teachers. You know, I can't remember when, but I know there was a time, and I just have the feeling there that teachers have a life outside of school. They're really people. You know, they go to the grocery store and stuff. Who would have known? Who would have known? Well, he had that same experience with his parents here. And then he makes this conclusion. He says, as an adult, I find that God also moves in ways and places of which I am totally unaware. God's world is bigger than ours. When God comes and says, follow me, if we understand that, we're able to simply follow. We don't need to get an explanation. We don't need to get directions. Simply call to follow. One of the questions that you may want to write down: do I require a certainty or answers from God before I follow? Do I require certainty or answers before I follow? Now, this is where there's a connection with Mark in the Old Testament passage from Jonah that we did not read. Jonah, many of you will know, didn't want to follow. And so he took off in the other direction, like somehow he could get away. Now, ironically, he went in the other direction precisely because he knew what God wanted. He knew what God wanted, and he didn't want anything to do with it. The book of Jonah begins with God calling Jonah to go and preach the word to the Ninevites so that they might repent and turn back to God and be saved. And he didn't want anything to do with that. He didn't like Ninevites. Israel didn't like Ninevites. So he he didn't want to do it, so he went the other way. Now, for us to understand this and what it has to say to us, we have to make some transitions. We have to understand who the Ninevites are for us. Who are those hated people that we don't want to go to? We don't want to admit that God might love them. We certainly don't want to point them in the direction of God. Maybe it's Iranians. Maybe it's North Koreans, though it's probably one little guy in North Korea that we don't want to do that too. Maybe it's homeless people. It might scare us a bit. We feel uncomfortable with. Maybe it's gay people. Maybe it's people who have hurt us that we just can't give up the hurt. Who is the Ninevite for you? It's not enough just to see this story as Jonah's story. Who is God calling us to reach out and to love? Jonah's not happy about going to those despised people. So he hops about going in the opposite direction, sailing away from the presence of God. Or so he thought. Then there's a great storm. He's tossed overboard. He catches a ride by a great fish, who dumps him out, guess where? On the shores of Nineveh. And he's not happy. God has to tell him again, go into the city and preach them what I want you to preach them. Let them know that they can be saved if they change, if they turn toward me. So, to summarize, Jonah went overboard in his efforts to get away from God. And he ended up in a whale of a mess. That's the story. Stick it to it. When Jonah finally got to Nineveh, he went to the edge of town, didn't even go in. Jonah's got a really bad attitude. And he delivered a one-sentence sermon, 5 words in Hebrew. 5 words. It was the shortest and worst sermon in the Bible. He said, 40 days and you're dead. And they got it. They understood that they needed to change and turn toward God, and they did, and Jonah was not happy. Jonah said, God, I knew you were going to do that. That's just why I didn't want to come. He didn't want them to escape God's wrath. Or better, the wrath he felt they should get. And he certainly didn't want to help. You may feel like that towards someone. Or someone's. Jonah just flat out had a bad attitude. Kind of reminds me of an airline that had kind of a process. They had forms to fill out. The pilot would fill out if there were problems in the flight so that the mechanics could look at it. And the mechanics would then log in their responses to whatever the problem was. So, here's the first problem. Left inside main tire almost needs replacement. Solution. Almost replaced left inside main tire. Problem. Something loose in cockpit. Solution. Something tightened in cockpit. Problem. Dead bugs on the windshield. Solution. Live bugs on back order. Problem. Evidence of leak on right main landing gear. Solution. Evidence removed. Problem. Suspected crack in windshield. Solution. Suspect you're right. Problem. Aircraft handles funny. Solution. Aircraft warned to straighten up and fly right. He couldn't get past his own way. How many of us cannot get past our own way? It's easier for me to say, oh, I know how he can't, I know how she can't, I know how she can't, I know how he can't, but to see my own is tough. The early Christians in the catacombs would draw images of their Christian faith. They almost never drew images of Jesus. But they would draw images of Jesus as Jonah. As Jonah. Jesus, like Jonah, was one who came preaching to God's enemies, and through his preaching transformed them into God's best friends. Jonah and Jesus are alike in that. And we are called by Jesus to follow him. Jesus knew, and Jonah learned, though he wasn't happy, God has no enemies. God has no enemies. Sometimes we think, well, if somebody speaks badly of God, we need to defend God. They're God's enemies. We don't need to. And we can't defend God. God can't defend God's self, then there's something wrong. We don't need to be reactive. God has no enemies. Only those who need to turn back to God. Find that relationship again. We might have enemies, but what does Jesus say to us about how we treat our enemies? We love our enemies. Trey, I know you said, oh, there you are. Yeah. We love them. Love our enemies. Pretty easy to do, right? Well, not really. Not really. We find ourselves more like Jonah. I'll love somebody I like. My enemies, I can't get there. That'll serve. Whatever it is there. Love our enemies. Not just simply like them or accept them, but love them. Love them. It's hard to do. Ask Jonah. A U.S. pilot discovered this biblical gospel truth on a bombing run. In his experience in Vietnam, he tells of bearing down on a Vietnamese village to drop his bombs, pushing through the clouds and catching a glimpse of church. Church. He said, it must have been Sunday because I could see a crowd of people entering the church in the village. It was only a glimpse, but I could see it clearly. They were Christians. Nobody ever told me that Vietnam had Christians. It could have been my hometown, my Catholic church. They looked just like us. They worshiped the same way we worshiped. Nobody told me. But Jesus told you. God's love doesn't stop at the border of any country. Did you know that? God's love does not have to pass through checkpoints. We of the church are called to love, no matter what. A couple of days ago, I heard on Christian radio a pastor's wife who was telling a story about their son who, as a teenager, made lots of bad choices. She didn't say what they were. But he either left home or was invited to leave home. I don't remember what she said. But he was gone for 2 years. And he contacted them and said, I want to come home. She surprised me by her answer. She said, it was the hardest thing we ever did, as we tried to figure out if it was the right thing or not. And then she said something that really surprised me. She said, we were worried that our congregation wouldn't understand if we took back this boy who made so many wrong choices. I thought, what? That's exactly the place where love should be. Well, she said, they did. They welcomed him, and the congregation welcomed him. That's what we're called to do. Not worry about what others might think. To do what we need to do. To love. To follow. No matter what the cost. No matter what the cost. We have been touched by God's love. We have been blessed by God's love. But it's not ours. It's God's. Who are our Ninevites? Where is it hard for us to love? Just like Jonah. That's where God calls us. May we find the strength and the power and the grace to offer what God already offered. Love, hope, and peace. May our hearts be enlarged.